Welcome to the review of the article, The Relationship Between Climate Change, Globalization, and Non-Communicable Diseases in Africa. This is a systematic review by Alhansen Siba. Climate change and globalization are both known as major 21st century health and developmental challenges, and we've been discussing that in the first few weeks of our class. Non-communicable diseases, as we've learned, disproportionately affect low and middle-income countries. This article was a systematic review with a total of 13,000 studies identified, and 27 studies met the criteria. And the focus was NCD pathways related to climate change and globalization in Africa. The findings overview found 3 different pathways linking climate change, globalization, and NCDs. It was found that the major NCDs were cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, chronic respiratory diseases, and cancer. And globalization and climate change act indirectly, so we can't always see this, through food production and nutrition, urbanization, and transformation of food systems. And these are the 3 pathways we will discuss. The first pathway looks at climate change and food production and nutrition. So we've learned that climate change reduces agricultural productivity, and that's because of the climate change causing droughts, heat waves, and also flooding. And the results lead to food insecurity and malnutrition, and that means that there's an increased reliance on processed, unhealthy foods, leading to a higher prevalence of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular diseases. And the article gives an example of the drought's effects in Tanzania, where there was a decline in rice and maize production by 7 to 13%. Pathway number 2 looks at globalization and urbanization. And this is driven by globalization and migration. The urban settings in general, regardless of where you live in the world, have increased risk factors for NCDs. There's overcrowding, there's increased stress levels, there could be reduced physical activity, and we see a transition to high-fat, low-nutrition diets. Women in urban areas have a high blood pressure prevalence, and the case study was looking at the urban-rural differences in Cameroon. Pathway number 3 looks at globalization and transformation of food systems. We've seen a shift from traditional markets to supermarkets and fast food, with the increased consumption of high-energy, nutrition-poor foods. The example given was in Kenya, where supermarket purchases were linked to obesity and pre-diabetes. We also have seen the influence of the global fast food chains on dietary patterns. So there is a synergetic effects of climate change and globalization. The two interact to exacerbate the NCD burden. Examples are the rising food prices during droughts. People rely on processed food, which leads to higher rates of obesity, and increased heat exposure, which you may not know, leads to worsened cardiac diseases, but also worsened diabetes management, where excessive heat can be detrimental to an individual's glycemic control, leading to glycemic shocks, so these spikes in blood sugars. Implications for policy is to enhance food security and look at agricultural resistance, address the urban health inequalities through targeted interventions, regulate processed food markets and promote healthy diets, and develop climate-sensitive NCD policies. The conclusion of the article was that climate change and globalization are key drivers of NCDs in Africa. Collaborative, multi-sectoral approaches are needed to mitigate the impact, so think of our health and all policies. For future research, we need to explore adaptive strategies and food system resilience to droughts and heat waves. And the call to action is engage policymakers, public health professionals, and communities in developing sustainable interventions.